On the morning of December 26, 1996, 911 received a call. It was Patsy Ramsey, hysterically telling them that her 6-year-old daughter was kidnapped. Her bed was empty, and there was a ransom note at the bottom of the staircase. And here began one of the most infamous, most gruesome, and most perplexing cases in U.S. history. The attempted kidnapping and murder of pageant queen JonBenet Ramsey inside her own home. And the main suspects? Her own 9-year-old brother, her mother, and her father. And spearheading the hunt was a police department that cared more about the reputation of their pristine, upper-class town than finding the person that killed America's little darling. Here's the unsolved torture and murder of JonBenet Ramsey, forever a kindergartner. You see, the Ramseys were the very embodiment of the American dream. Rich, successful, and the picture of the perfect family, just like the Hallmark catalog pictures made you wish you had. John owned a successful software company, and Patsy spent her time decorating their gorgeous home in Boulder, Colorado, entertaining guests, and entering her pretty little daughter in beauty pageants. JonBenet won just about every pageant she entered, blonde, blue-eyed, and as cute as could be. The 6-year-old was everything that her mother, also an ex-beauty pageant contestant, could have wanted in a daughter. Burke, JonBenet's older brother by 3 years, was a joker and a clown. He ran and climbed and played like most boys his age do. The family had a lot to live up to. I mean, they were practically local celebrities. John's business made the news on more than one occasion for breaking the $1 billion mark in '96. JonBenet had won so many pageants in and around Boulder that she was featured in the Christmas play at the local mall, and she was put center stage on the Thanksgiving float a few months prior. Her name and pageant title emblazoned on the float for all to see. The day before Christmas, the family opened their home to the neighborhood for a Christmas showing, allowing everyone and their second cousin access to their house. If you're anything like me, a normal person without obscene amounts of money, this idea is a foreign concept to you too. Basically, what this open house event was, in neighborhoods like this at least, was that one house is chosen, decorated like a postcard, and the people of Boulder could come to view it. The kids got to sit on the rented Santa's lap to request special presents while fancy finger foods and tea was passed around. Dozens, if not hundreds of people traipsed through the house that day. Christmas morning started with a great deal of excitement. JonBenet got the bicycle that she wanted, and Burke got a huge model train set to go with the dozens of others he was so serious about collecting. Then, the family went off to dinner with friends. Naturally, this was also a several-course event, held under enough lights and baubles to power a small village. They returned at around 10 that evening, planning to get up early to catch their personal plane to continue their vacation at a different location. Patsy was up at 6:30, on her way to put on some coffee so that she could start packing for the trip, only to be met with 3 sheets of paper at the bottom of the stairs. In the letter, the person claimed to be part of a larger organization that had taken JonBenet. They demanded silence, cooperation, and a ransom of $118,000, conveniently the exact amount that John received as a Christmas bonus. The letter concluded that the family had to wait until 10 that morning for a call from the kidnappers. Sure enough, JonBenet was not in her bed or anywhere John and Patsy looked. They left Burke to sleep, oblivious to the sudden movement in the house, while Patsy frantically called 911. Before police arrived, Patsy had called their longtime friends, who arrived at the house just minutes before police did. If you've been keeping up so far, you'd have noticed that the Boulder police were walking into an absolute nightmare of a crime scene. Not only was this family from down the street making tea in the kitchen and tidying up the place, they were sitting on couches and using the bathroom, not to mention the hundreds of feet from the open house event from the day before. An uncountable amount of fingerprints and DNA were left all over the place long before the police arrived, and they allowed it to become even more contaminated by allowing half the neighborhood to come inside to offer moral support. To make matters worse, the Boulder police were completely inexperienced in dealing with high-profile cases like this. Boulder is about as cookie-cutter as you can get. They never had to deal with crimes of this magnitude, and everything about the Ramsey case was mishandled from the start. First, they interviewed the couple together and allowed them to remain inside the home. They were fine with the fact that they made calls and continued to use the various rooms in the house while police did a cursory search of the premises. When they found nothing, the couple were left with a single junior police officer for a few hours. 10 o'clock came and went with no call from the kidnappers. So Officer Linda Ardent, not knowing what to do with the agitated father and his heavily sedated wife, told John to take her through the house so that they could take a look to see if anything was out of place, just to keep them all occupied. She allowed yet another family friend to accompany them. This house was huge, so the officer hoped that a look around would keep John busy for an hour or two at least. John decided to start at the bottom and work his way up, with Officer Ardent in tow. He started in the basement, a massive space separated into various rooms, one for Burke's many train sets, another for Patsy's art supplies and the family's luggage that had a small window inside, and another to store furniture. This place was pitch black. You wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face, yet John, approaching the door to the room with the window, let out a strangled cry. Before anyone had the chance to switch on a light, he'd seen JonBenet on the floor and rushed to pick her up. As he came by, carrying the tiny limp form, Arden could clearly see that the little girl was dead. No one stopped John. They simply allowed him to carry his daughter to the foyer, where he laid her on the ground. Not only had police obviously not searched the basement at all that morning, they allowed a father to find the brutalized remains of his 6-year-old daughter, partially covered in a thin sheet that was taken from the basement, or a storage closet. No one could decide which. JonBenet was dressed in a nightshirt, underwear, and a pair of long johns. The pants and underwear was soaked in her own urine, and they were not the clothes that Patsy had put her to bed in. Her bed was also wet, so this was where she'd soiled herself. But there were no traces other than JonBenet's urine on that bed to indicate that anyone else had been in it besides JonBenet. Her mouth was covered in duct tape, and there was a strip of nylon rope around her neck with a broken paintbrush twisted at the back. The brush had been used to make a garrote to choke her, and she had a head wound on the top of her head. The autopsy later revealed that JonBenet had been strangled first and then struck on the head after she died. The official cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. Though there have been no evidence of complete penetrative sexual assault, JonBenet had been subjected to some degree of assault with the same paintbrush that was later used to strangle her. Her body was wiped down by a cloth that was no longer at the scene, evidenced by the fibers all over her body. There were no traces of DNA on her besides her own. She had a small puncture wound behind her ear that looked like 2 bug bites, but many have thought that these could have been from a taser gun. There were traces of pineapple and milk in her digestive tract, indicating that she'd had eaten it in the 2 hours before her death. Now this was murder. Murder in a sleepy, affluent town where nothing but opulent dinner parties and parades ever happen. A brutal death of an angelic 6-year-old cherub who'd only ever known love, privilege, and looked like everything the American dream was based on. JonBenet Ramsey and her entire family were thrown into a media storm that America hadn't seen before. Clips of the dolled-up, bedazzled pageant queen, made to look much older than she was, and prancing around a stage like a well-trained show pony. Even back then, the public opinion toward the child's parents wasn't favorable. And let's face it, it's a horrendous pastime to put any child into. But my deep disgust for child pageantry and the deplorable conditions they put these kids in is a personal opinion. Patsy wasn't the only mother in Boulder doing it, not by a long shot. Heck, JonBenet was enthralled with her own crowns and trophies, and everyone attested that she loved being the center of attention. But that face, caked in makeup, with her perfect blonde curls, infatuated the public like no other case of this nature ever had before. With this, the Ramseys lawyered up, and here I don't blame them. The Boulder police fell on the family like rabid dogs. They were wildly incompetent, and they refused all outside help, assistance that they sorely needed after butchering up this case from the very beginning. Their absolute insistence on doing this all by themselves, even showing away the FBI when they offered their time, shows that most of this case was run on the egos of men that were more concerned with their town's pristine image than the death of a child. In those first months, they focused only on the family and no one else. There were no moves to question violent offenders in the vicinity. They barely interviewed the scores of guests that entered the Ramsey home the day before, and they accepted no other theories other than the Ramseys being the culprits. And when the Ramseys wanted to consult their lawyers before sitting down for an interrogation, Boulder police decided to play dirty They leaked the family's decision to let their lawyers advise them to the papers, intentionally making it look like they were uncooperative. This caused the whole world to point fingers at the Ramseys, outright accusing them of murdering and sexually assaulting their own child. And let's not forget that their forensics department was so utterly incompetent that they lost several pieces of evidence taken from the home. Look, I'm critical of the Ramseys for a lot of their actions, but I don't blame them for retreating from the police after all the terrible decisions the authorities made. But there are a significant number of reasons that investigators were so sure that the attack happened by someone in the home. So let's look at some of the oddities, shall we? First off, only the duct tape and nylon rope could not be traced to the home. All of the other items used in JonBenet's murder came from inside the residence. The paintbrush was taken from a box of Patsy's old art supplies, and the ransom note and the pen used to write it were all found next to the telephone in the hall. The killer had to have taken some time to find a new set of clothes from an unfamiliar house to dress her in. The blunt object that struck her on the head was still a mystery, and no one heard a thing throughout the night. Now, this last detail can be explained. JonBenet was 6 years old, meaning she'd have been easy to overpower and keep quiet, especially with the use of a taser that would knock such a tiny body out cold. It's highly likely that she was rendered unconscious while she was in bed by the taser, causing her to lose control of her bladder when she was shocked. Not to mention that the house was absolutely enormous, and she was in the bedroom farthest away from her parents. But the killer did take an inordinate amount of time to write a rambling ransom note that stretched 3 pages long. So how does a planned kidnapping accidentally turn into murder? After the victim was dead, they still went to all the effort of leaving a ransom note for a dead baby that they dumped in the basement. Half of the scene screamed an unplanned attack, especially since most of the items used came from the Ramsey home, and 2 separate methods were used to kill her. Yet, the steps taken after her death, like the unusually long note, and the staging of the scene indicated that there was more time taken to stage the whole scene than there was to attempt to kidnap and kill her. This behavior leans more towards a planned event, a badly executed plan, but a plan nonetheless. Why would a kidnapping, with the intention of a ransom being attempted with barely any outside tools, go so wrong that the perpetrator ends up killing the victim he intended to remove from the property alive? Also, police decreed that there were no footprints in the fresh snow leading to or from the home. So unless the perpetrator used the locked front door, he came from inside. This theory is wildly inaccurate. I'll get into why there were multiple points of entry in a moment. Let's first understand why the police came to this conclusion. They decided that the small open window above JonBenet's head was too small for a man to get through. Further indicating that this was not the point of entry was a spider web that was undisturbed in the corner of the window. Beneath the open window, a suitcase was placed, apparently so the killer could use it to get out. But because they felt that no adult could climb through it, they suspected that the suitcase was planted there. It was later proved that even an unusually tall individual could get in and get out. They'd just have to be a little more skinny than usual. If they'd gotten out of that exit point, they'd have reached the driveway that had no snow on it at all, leaving no footprints behind. The only thing that the window proves is that Boulder PD were terrible at their jobs. Look, you can spin this any way you want. The Boulder police screwed up this crime scene so badly that there's no way to ascertain what was inside or outside of the gigantic house. If I were the Ramseys, I wouldn't have been willing to sit down with a department that refused more qualified help either. They denied that they did anything wrong and made the parents the sole focus of their attention without considering any other alternative at all. The BPD wanted the Ramseys' blood, and no other theory or possibility would even be looked at as far as they were concerned. So the Ramseys' decision to operate only by their lawyer's advice is completely understandable, even though it looks suspicious to us on the outside. We didn't see that they were compliant in the first few days. They gave handwriting samples, blood, and hair without resistance, but refused to sit down for interviews after it became clear that they were the only focus for the police. It was only after this fact that they handed over all decision-making to their lawyers, who refused to let the police interview their clients for nearly a month. Eventually, everyone, including 9-year-old Burke, were interviewed individually, but only after everyone was allowed the proper representation, as was their right to have. The ransom note was a point of contention from the start. The inordinate length was just the tip of the iceberg. The handwriting was similar to Patsy's, but the experts are divided on whether or not it actually matched her handwriting. The details inside the 3 pages were very telling too. The ransom amount was extremely specific, indicating that the killer had inside knowledge of John's business or that they were in very close contact with the family. It was exactly what John's Christmas bonus came out to, $118,000, not a cent more or a dollar less. Nothing much was gained from those interviews, except 2 hours for each Burke, Patsy, and John to go over the same set of events that they'd reported on that first day. Their statements were almost identical to what it had been when they were interviewed together a month prior. After the public pressure became too much to ignore, Detective Lou Smith, a rock star in the force, came out of retirement to look into the case. Smith found the shoe print in the original photos that police completely discarded. The partial high-tech boot print couldn't be definitively matched to anyone, and Smith was the one that proved that an intruder could have come through the window. He also discovered that there were 3 other points of possible entry that the Boulder police never bothered to put into their official report. Smith just made the logical effort to actually look at the photographs. There were 2 more windows, one unlocked, and the other a window that had been broken for months. There was an unlocked door at the back of the house, too. He found no less than 34 registered sex offenders living within a 2-mile radius of the Ramsey home that were never looked into, and he discovered that there were over 100 burglaries reported in the neighborhood in the 2 months before JonBenet's death. If you thought that was bad, just hold on. It gets worse. Besides an obvious serial burglar, there was a horrifying case in that time where an 8-year-old girl was assaulted in the middle of the night by a masked intruder who come through the window and attacked her in her own bed. The girl's mother just happened to hear a muffled squeak from her room while she went to the bathroom and caught the perpetrator in the act. He then fled from the open window, and he's never been identified. Unfortunately, the moment Smith pointed out all of the things Boulder PD missed or discounted and suggested that they look into alternatives, the department shut down their cooperation. Boulder police were totally unwilling to accept their terrible mistakes and refused to consider anything other than the theories they decided were the only options on the table. They were more concerned with sugarcoating more than 100 burglaries and a vicious assault on a child. To admit that they had a serial burglar and possibly a serial child predator on their hands would have tainted the town's pristine reputation. Smith was so disgusted at their complete lack of professionalism and the tunnel vision that villainized potentially innocent people that he walked away from the case. Smith was an amazing detective in his day, well worth all the hype he got. Everyone can agree that his opinion is worth a great deal. Smith did not believe that the Ramseys were responsible, and he remained firm on that stance until the day he died. Police had 3 theories, the first being that John molested his daughter, accidentally killed her, and staged the scene to make it look like a murder. The second was that Patsy beat her daughter to death in a fit of rage when JonBenet wet the bed, a problem the little girl was known to have, and she and John set out to write this note and display the body to make it look the way it did. Then there's the Burke theory, and the one that most of the public seems to lean towards. So let me walk you through it. The children like to make themselves a bowl of pineapple and milk as a snack. Apparently, that combination was a favorite in the house. It sounds disgusting to me, but hey, I've eaten worse. The thought is that Burke got up to make himself a snack. JonBenet happened to get up too and stole a piece of pineapple out of his bowl. That would explain why the amount in her stomach was so minute and why Patsy and John couldn't recall any of them having any pineapple that night. Burke, being an annoyed older brother with the self-control of a typical 9-year-old, then hit his sister over the head with the closest thing he could find, a heavy metal flashlight that stood on the counter. The bowl of pineapple and the flashlight was photographed by Boulder police, but it was never examined up close, nor was it taken into evidence. When the parents realized what their son had done, they cleaned the flashlight and garroted their already dying daughter to death because they might have mistakenly thought she was dead already, and then proceeded to sexually violate her to sell the predatory intruder angle. So instead of losing both kids, they protected the one that they could. Not a single one of these theories makes any sense at all, in my opinion. First, John already had 2 daughters and a son from a previous marriage, and all of them, his ex-wife included, made it quite clear that John abusing any of his children was a ridiculous idea. JonBenet showed no signs of being sexually abused outside of some pretty typical 6-year-old bedwetting. There are not enough prior signs to indicate that John was a deviant of any kind. As for Patsy's outburst, that isn't all that substantial either. The housekeeper confirmed that Patsy was frustrated with JonBenet's bedwetting, but she'd never reacted violently toward her children before. They'd never even been spanked in their entire lives. So Patsy, too, has no previous markers of a child abuser. Also, the blow to the head happened after the strangulation and the assault, and all of the theories require that someone hit her over the head first and used the strangulation and later violations as a cover-up. Besides that discrepancy and the fact that a medical examiner confirmed that she'd been hit over the head after the strangulation and molestation, don't you think that a mother and father who just lost their clearly beloved daughter to a terrible accident would go so far as to inflict these repulsive acts on her corpse? To mutilate their child's remains after death is an extremely heinous act, one which most people can't stomach, let alone a pair of vanilla suburban folks who couldn't even bring themselves to administer corporal punishment to their children. I just don't think they had it in them. The Ramseys had a $100,000 reward out for information on their daughter's murder, and they spent more money than any of us see in a lifetime to pay for private investigators, which some argue is much more than the Boulder Police Department bothered to do. In all other regards, none of the family ever showed any previous signs of deviancy or violence, with the exception of Burke, who had hit his sister with a toy golf club years before. Burke was a hyperactive child, and he picked on his sister. Neither of these are unusual for a 9-year-old by any means. Unfortunately, the dramatized public opinion on this relatively normal older sibling behavior has only added fodder to the theory that Burke was a deranged little killer in the making. I'm sorry, but nothing about Burke's behavior validates the world's decision that he's a calculated killer or even an accidental one at all. There just isn't enough here to make such a statement. In 2003, with a new chief in charge, Boulder police reopened the case. This time, all of the evidence that wasn't misplaced or completely lost were re-examined. It was well worth the effort because they found a whole lot of DNA that the initial investigation didn't. On JonBenet's underwear, they found one set of male DNA and a second sample that was not related to the first, but it was too degraded to test. Additionally, there was more DNA on the nylon cord and paintbrush found that culminated in 5 separate DNA samples from unknown individuals that did not show up in CODIS. None of the samples matched the Ramseys. Let me make some things plain before we continue. All of the screw-ups and the many instances of contamination, the 4 separate entrance points, the shoe prints, and the 5 different DNA samples not only disproves the Ramseys' involvement, it also puts absolutely everything that the Boulder police touched into question. No evidence or theory out of that department holds any weight at all. The Ramseys are guilty of only 2 things: refusing to work with a police department that dragged their name through the mud and gave the Ramseys every reason to avoid them, and they were guilty of putting their daughter in the spotlight, into a competition sphere that is notorious for being a magnet for child predators. The Boulder police and half the world think it's one of the Ramseys, but every FBI specialist, profiler, and expert that's ever talked to them and reviewed the case thinks otherwise. In other words, the professionals who actually know what they're doing are of the opinion that this was an intruder. Specifically, that the intruder was a young male who had a personal grudge against John Ramsey, and he wanted to violate and destroy the most important thing to John, his youngest child. A young, inexperienced culprit would explain why the murder and assault were improvised. The exact number on John's Christmas bonus could have been found out by an employee or an ex-employee who still had friends in the company. And it would make it possible for the attacker to know the layout of the house, how far JonBenet's room was, and how to get in and out with little to no effort. We're still left with the unexplained pineapple in her stomach and the 5 separate male DNA profiles found on her body. Although, let's be honest, with Boulder Police's questionable handling of evidence and their track record of tainting and misplacing everything they touch, it could have been any one of dozens of crime scene techs or storage room workers who left trace DNA on the garments with ungloved hands. The taser also points toward an intruder who wanted to subdue her, not congruent with the accidental murder by Burke, Patsy losing her temper, or the long-time abuse at her father's hands. And finally, she was wiped down. Had the family been trying to obscure evidence, it would have made more sense to wash her with soap and water. With a house that has multiple baths and everyone awake, so you wouldn't have to be quiet about the affair, why bother with just a dry cloth if there are more efficient alternatives? Were the Ramseys acting unconventionally? Yes, they were. Patsy was barely intelligible during interviews because she was tranquilized to Kingdom Come to deal with this horrendous situation. I have no issue with their reluctance to work with police, nor do I see any reason to place Patsy under the microscope for needing medication to keep her from falling apart. There is no right way to handle losing your child to murder, so none of us can say that their behavior is unusual. Within days of their loss, their every word, action, and interaction was dictated by lawyers and advisors. The only people I want to criticize here are the killer, of course, and the Boulder PD. They are the reason we don't have any answers. Their incompetence didn't just bungle the case back then. It ensured that we'll never get any answers ever. Even if someone confesses, it won't be enough because the BPD contaminated so much that no item of evidence can be linked to anything anymore. Let's say it was the Ramseys. Well, there's 5 sets of DNA to disprove that. What if a serial offender comes out of the woodworks, confesses, draws a whole blueprint of the house as proof, and he matches one of the 5 DNA samples? Then there's still 4 unaccounted samples. Scores of evidence bags that are just missing and decades of time gone by to degrade whatever might have survived. No, the Boulder Police Department is to blame for everything as far as I'm concerned. They are the reason that JonBenet Ramsey, an innocent 6-year-old girl, will forever lie in her grave with no justice at all. The entire justice system in that town, the prosecutors, judges, police chiefs, and the officers themselves were a corrupt group of rats that were used to getting their way, regardless of what the rules that the legal system put in place were. They believed that they were above the law, and it's their egos that leaves me to put the majority of the weight of JonBenet's death on their shoulders. I will not be going into the viable suspects this time around. None of them have been officially declared as suspects by the only department who's ever had complete control of this case. So, unless they are officially named as suspects, I believe that they carry the simple human right to their anonymity. As unpleasant as some of these characters are, and as heinous as the crimes that they were convicted for were, we cannot imply their guilt without police officially indicating otherwise. And the Boulder police, still to this day, even after they dragged Patsy Ramsey to court only for a jury to decree her innocent, has made it clear that there are no other suspects and they will not waste their resources into investigating child predators at all. Even if one of those predators confessed to a friend just days after the murder and had access to a taser that matched the wounds behind JonBenet's ear, not to mention a string of violent offenses targeted towards little girls. Oh yes, that's just the circumstances surrounding one of the potential suspects. There are many more with equally hideous motives. I am perfectly aware that I'm in the minority when it comes to who the guilty one is here, since everyone believes it was one of the family members. But here's the thing. I don't agree or disagree with the Ramseys being guilty. What I'm saying is, our theories don't matter at all because we'll never know. This case is never going to be solved. Boulder PD made sure of that. So focus your finger pointing at the department that can still change their destructive disregard for anything other than their town's appearance and their incomprehensible incompetence. We might not be able to find the killer, but we can stop this disgrace of justice from happening again. So let's focus on what we can change. This is how an incompetent police department single-handedly destroyed any chance of finding JonBenet Patricia Ramsey's killer. A child whose name will forever be associated with one of the most gruesome and unforgettable crimes of the 20th century. A baby immortalized only by her pageant photo, never to grow up, never given a chance to have a life, a career, or to have children of her own. It doesn't matter who you think did it. Patsy, John, Burke, a disgruntled employee, or deranged child stalker. Never forget who kept this case from being solved in the first place. A murder that damaged an entire town, destroyed a family, and a little girl whose biggest dream was to get a bicycle from Santa that year.